Good morning. As usual, it's good to see everybody. Certainly is good to be here. If you have your Bibles out and you want to turn to Ephesians chapter 4, if you want to follow along on the screen, you're welcome to do that as well. You might know this passage by heart by now, but we're going to finish this series of lessons up this morning as we've been discussing the 7 facts or truths or absolutes that Paul gives us in these chapters. And so let me read it to you again, and then we'll begin our discussion on the number 7. The passage says, there is one body, one Spirit, just as also you were called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all, through all, and in all. So this morning, that number 7 is going to be that there is one God and Father. And so we're going to be talking about that and thinking about what that means and trying to understand what Paul is talking about and learning in a more greater way how to apply that to our lives. I'm sure that you have probably heard, and I know you have, and it's not a big secret, not a big surprise, but I'm sure that you've all heard about the Big Bang Theory. It's taught in schools. It's been taught for many, many years. And basically a real short version of it is the theory basically states that about 13.8 billion years ago or something like that, there was a very dense, extremely hot spot. They theorize it's about the size of, smaller than the head of a needle, but it was just a concentrated mass, and that spot exploded. And the process of the expansion of that concentrated spot spread throughout the known cosmos, and through the process of cooling, formed many of the particles and elements possible for matter, life to exist as we know it. And so that's the running theory. Of course, that's obviously a very short version of it, and there's a lot of scientific jargon that goes in a lot of that I honestly don't understand. And in all reality, there are some scientific principles within the theory, of course, like many theories, that are scientific. They're true. They've actually can be observed and seen in nature, and that's a lot of where they built the building blocks for the theory from. But a large majority of it is still very much theory. It's just filling in the blanks, which are very broad and many, to try to explain that particular theory. Now, that whole idea didn't really come to light until around 1927. Is about when the roots or the foundation of that theory began to be laid and taking hold of by the scientific community in exploring those ideas. And so it's not a big surprise when we turn to our Bibles and we don't actually see the Bible writers ever talking about it. It just wasn't something that was even in the thought of man until around that period of time, over 100 years ago or so, that has been mulling around in our textbooks, in our minds, in our scientific communities. And so the Bible, when you approach the Bible with those kinds of ideas about, where did the world come from? Where did the cosmos come from? The Bible really has a very simple and direct and plain statement at the very beginning of the book, when it just simply says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Really that simple. There's probably a lot more complexity even to that statement that we would struggle to comprehend or understand, but it's a really simple idea that there is a creator, God, and He created the heavens and the earth. I always like what Richard Rogers, you may not know who Richard Rogers is. He was one of the professors at Sunset many years ago, but he had a statement I always enjoyed hearing whenever he said it. And he said, I don't mind the Big Bang Theory as long as God's doing the banging and it was all done in 6 days, was what he would say. And so I like that. I like that sentiment. It's one of those things that we sometimes struggle with in trying to balance our faith in observable scientific theories and facts and whatnot. And really, there's a lot of times some overlap in ideas as we explore God's creation and come to realize things that God has done that are marvelous and beautiful and tangible and for us to observe and to understand. But the idea that the universe created itself, it's a relatively new idea. And so we're not going to find biblical passages that directly focus on that because it's relatively new. But the people of Bible times had a different issue that was dealt with. They had a different problem that they would deal with that you hear more frequently discussed in reference to the existence of God. And it wasn't so much the existence of God, but it was the fact that many people, especially in the pagan world, were polytheistic. They believed in multiple gods. They had views about every aspect of life, and they would have gods that would govern all sorts of things for the sky and for the earth and for the water and for life and death and various different aspects that we see and observe with our eyes, things of this world. And so that's the issue that most commonly came up and was most commonly dealt with. And so that's really where we need to be in understanding who is God. So there's a question that comes up also, and it's really doesn't get addressed as much. It's just an assumption, well, God. But what does that mean? I mean, what does it mean to be a God? Defining those terms or trying to figure out what it means. And simply put, a God is just a higher power. He is a higher power, in the form of the polytheistic view would be just anyone or anything that's a higher power. It's an object of worship. That is as how we would think about a God, one in whom humans put their trust, that is beyond things beyond their control. So the things that we imagine that are beyond our control, then we would want to acknowledge some higher power, something out there that we could worship that is beyond us, that can control the things that we cannot control. And so that is a very simplified but basic definition of how we would define the term God. But because humans are self-aware, because mentally we have emotions that govern our decisions, and we think about the future, we think about the past, we have all of these mental capabilities that allow us to think about these things. We contemplate our own existence. We contemplate our future. We I don't imagine a squirrel really cares about where he's going when he dies, but we do. We concern ourselves with those things. And so we ask questions, and humanity has always asked questions like, where do we come from? We want to know. We want some answers, right? We think about that kind of stuff. Where are we going? Right? And in our case, where are we going when we die, but also just what the future holds. And why are we here? Those are the kind of things we think about because of the minds in which we have. We contemplate those things. And because humanity has always looked beyond themselves for answers, to look at the tangible things of life in order to explain the things that are not so tangible, we want answers to these kinds of questions. Now, Paul has a very interesting statement in Romans chapter 1. And we're going to be looking at several passages, several statements, and thinking about this idea. But I wanted to start in Romans chapter 1 and verse 20 briefly and look at this passage. This comes from the Apostle Paul. And he says, "For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made." Now, this is very similar to what the psalmist says in Psalm 19 and verse 1. He says this, "The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of His hands." And so the Bible all throughout continues to point to creation, to point to order, to point to the fact that we exist. I mean, that's something that we cannot deny, that we're actually here, that we actually have feelings, that we actually have emotions, that we are physically present. The Bible constantly points to those things as evidence that there is a higher power, that there is something beyond us, a grand designer beyond us and above us, that is in control of all things. And so the Bible continues to point to those kinds of things. You've heard the old example, and it's not new to me and certainly not new to you, I'm sure, but the idea of a tornado passing through a junkyard and then forming a perfectly functional flying airplane. The odds of that happening of course, in our minds would be pretty much zero. I mean, how could that ever really possibly happen? But the odds of having something that is totally chaotic and then having something like chaos, like a tornado, rush through that kind of chaotic landscape with all of this junk and form a perfectly functioning flying airplane is about the same as having the kind of order that creation presents to us. It's the kind of like saying, well, would it be even feasible in the mind of humanity to say that from a explosion and expansion of the universe, we could have the kind of order that we currently have? And it's the odds are pretty much about the same, they say. It's pretty close. There's some number. It's astronomically difficult to even comprehend the number, but there are some numbers they've come up with, and the odds are very low. That's all I could say, that anything like that could ever possibly happen, but that's the idea. And so when we think about God, think about asking those simple questions. What is a God? And it's the idea that there is a higher power out there that is responsible for the order that we see in the universe and in our lives. And so the second question would be, who is God? So if we can just mentally wrap our heads around, it makes a lot of sense that there's a higher power. There's something out there. The question comes down to, who is he? Who is this God that created all things? And there are some passages that describe God in the Bible, and we're only going to look at a few of them. I mean, I was going back and forth on different ones and thinking about all the ones that could be very helpful. I just picked these. There's only about 3 of them, and like I said, there's a bunch. But we're only going to look at these, and we're only going to look at them briefly. So Isaiah 40 and verse 28 is a good passage to look at. And it says this, he says, "Do you not know, have you not heard, the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, does not become weary or tired. His understanding is inscrutable." I didn't even know if I was going to be able to say that word. It's one of those words that you think to yourself, I don't think that could ever come out of my mouth. 1 Timothy 1 and verse 17 says, "Now to the King eternal, immortal, invisible, the only God, be honor and glory forever and ever." And the last one comes from Jesus himself. He says this in John chapter 4 and verse 24. He says, "God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth." Now, I realize a lot more passages we can look at, but this gives us a really good list of things that as we're contemplating who God is, will be very helpful for us. And the list is such. Who is God? God is everlasting. He is eternal. God wasn't created. He just simply has always existed. I don't know how to wrap my head around that because my life doesn't work that way. My worldview doesn't work that way. I'm very carnal. There's always a beginning and an end to pretty much everything that I experience in life. But for God, He is beyond that kind of time restraint. He is eternal. He is creator. In other words, He is the grand mind, the beautiful mind involved in creating everything that we observe with our eyes. And I am not remotely opposed to science. I think science is a beautiful work of being able to observe and properly analyze the world in which we live in, as long as we recognize and continue to understand those things were created by God, and what we're observing is His beautiful mind and His beautiful creation, and not trying to push Him out of it. And that's sometimes what people do, and I hate that, but the reality is science is a beautiful observation of what God has created, and we need to continue looking and being amazed at what He has done. God is all-knowing. He knows all things. He understands all things, all comprehension, all our feeble minds might be able to manifest. God is far beyond. He is spirit, Jesus says, which just simply gives us the idea that He is otherworldly. He is not of this world in the reference to flesh and blood. He was present before the world was created. He created what we see in the present existence that we can observe. He is spirit. He's beyond that. He is immortal. You know, the same idea. He's not human. Now, what we do recognize in the gospel is God becoming human, and what a beautiful example of love that is. But as God goes, He existed before this creation, before we were in existence. He is immortal. He is the object of worship. That's who God is. In other words, we look to Him, we bow to Him, we worship that God. And He is the only God. This whole idea of this polytheistic view of multiple gods that govern different aspects of life and have different agendas and purposes is a Gentile way of thinking. It's a worldly way of thinking for those who acknowledge the existence of a greater power. But for Christians, we acknowledge that there is only one true God who carries all of those attributes. And we're really just scratching the surface of this because I want us to have some time to address the reason for Paul's statement, I believe, that there is one God and one Father. So God's people throughout time have dealt with the issue, and you've heard it, you've read about it, you may not understand it to its totality, and I don't know if I quite understand it to its totality, but it's the reality of idolatry. It has been around for a long time. And really, we can define it, we can think about it, but it's not as much part of our world as it was their world. And the Jewish people, the people of the Old Covenant, struggled greatly with idolatry. It was something that they really had a hard time with. And so let's look at Exodus 20. And this is where this is where God gives these commandments and says that, this is wrong, that looking to other gods is wrong, that having idols is wrong. Let's read the passage together. It says, "You shall not make for yourselves an idol, or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments." Don't make images. Don't make these representations of these so-called gods, and don't bow and worship them. Don't offer sacrifice to them. I have never in my life had a desire to go to an object and offer any kind of sacrifice. But it was very much part of the world in which God's covenant people lived. That was a part of it. And in most cases, it was a desire to receive something in return. They believed, and many of the people believed, that they would offer a sacrifice to some kind of physical object that represented some God, that they would receive something in return. And whatever that something was something they felt like they needed. It may have been food, it may have been life, it may have been whatever the case may be, rain. They had different gods that they would offer for that purpose, and that was a very common practice. And God is telling His people through these commands, don't do that. Don't make idols for yourselves. Don't look to other gods. Don't even make an idol of God. And it's a really interesting idea because when we think about making images, because that's literally what that word means, right? Images, objects. When we think about making images, we don't make images of God because God already has an image. He already has an image bearer in this world that He created. And you know who that is? That's you. And that's me. We're the ones who bear the image of God. In fact, look at Genesis 1:26. It says, "And then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over the cattle and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them. There's a very interesting parallel in Romans chapter 1 in this passage. And I want you to pay attention to what Paul says here, because that was the initial idea. That's what God did, created man in his own image for the purpose of ruling over creation. And I just want you to see what his creation did in return. And this is where the idea of idolatry really comes to a head. Look at verse 20 of Romans chapter 1. It says, "For since the creation of the world, the invisible attributes, the eternal power, divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they were without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened." In verse 22, "Professing to be wise, they became foolish, exchanging the glory of the God for an image in the form of corruptible man, birds, four-footed animals, crawling creatures." You know, it's kind of like God creates us in his own image to co-rule with him over creation, and humanity turns around and begins to worship creation with their ignorance and their futile minds. The temptation to worship objects seems to have come from a very real desire, as I mentioned before, this desire to get something that they feel like they need. It becomes a lack of trust for God as the main provider. It becomes a way of saying, you know, Lord, I don't really know if you're going to give me what I need, but those folks over there are worshiping that statue, and they seem to be getting what they need. You know, maybe I ought to go over there. Maybe I ought to put up a statue. Maybe it's worth the effort. Maybe it'll be my lucky rabbit's foot. Maybe it'll help the rains to come when I don't see the rains, or maybe it'll help the people who are sick to get well, or people become desperate and they start looking for all kinds of things, and God's people certainly did that. They would begin to put up these idols in holy places. Often it says on high mountains, would erect these idols in which they would worship. And eventually it became a big issue for them and a major problem for them. And so I like this definition. It didn't come from me. I don't recall exactly who it came from, but I feel like it's helpful in trying to make this concept and this principle of idolatry very personal in our lives in the present. Anything that you value more than God, anything that you seek to give what only God can give. In other words, is it possible to take the principle of idolatry, not so much the statue, not so much the bowing down to something in worship, but is it possible for us as people today to value things of this world more than we value God? Yes, it is. We lose focus. Is it possible for us to seek out anything to give us what only God can give us? And yes, it is possible. And so we need to be careful not to fall into these traps of the foolishness of idolatry. I love this passage. This comes from Isaiah 46. It is one of my favorite passages where God directly addresses the idolatry of his people. And it's just a great passage. I want to read it to you. It starts in verse 5. It says, "To whom would you liken me and make me equal and compare me, that we would be alike? Those who lavish gold from a purse and weigh silver on a scale." And then he says, "Hire a goldsmith, and he makes it into a god. And they bow down. Indeed, they worship it. They lift it up upon their shoulders and they carry it. They set it in its place, and it stands there. It doesn't move from its place. Though one may cry to it, it can't answer. It cannot deliver him from his distress." I mean, he's just addressing the ignorance and the foolishness of this principle of idolatry. And he says, what do? They go and they take precious metals and golds and silvers and wood, and they create for themselves or have something created for them. They bow to it, they worship it, but they got to carry it. They got to move it around and lug it around. They got to put it in its place. They've got to go to it to talk to it. It doesn't hear. It doesn't listen. It doesn't care. It doesn't acknowledge their existence. It's just a thing. But they still worship it. And they still expect it to give what only God can give. Look at verse 8. He says, "Remember this and be assured. Recall it to your mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things long past. Listen, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is no one like me. One of the big struggles that Christians dealt with as Christianity became a powerful movement in the world was the fact that the world in which they were in was still very steeped in idolatry in many different forms. Whether it came in the form of worshiping emperors or worshiping objects, whatever the case may be, they had to live in that world somehow in some way. And one of the things that they had to have was food. Everybody needs food. They need basic necessities. And it's not like our kind of situation where we can go to Walmart or we can order stuff on Amazon and it shows up on our doorstep. They had to go to the market and actually buy this stuff. And a lot of the food that they were buying in the marketplace, the people that were selling it were idol worshipers, and they would offer this food to their gods. And it became such a difficult issue because the Jewish people would not buy from the Gentile marketplaces. And then all of a sudden, when they became Christian, they couldn't buy from the Jewish marketplaces because they were basically cast out of every market that was available to them. So they had a real struggle with how they were going to live and continue to live. And so most often in the New Testament, that's what is being addressed, is this very difficult struggle on how to balance your faith, your acknowledgement of God, and the idol world in which you live in. And so I want to address that real quick, just Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 4. Paul says this. He says, therefore, concerning the eating of things sacrificed to idols, that was their problem. He says, when we know that there is, listen to what Paul says, no such thing as an idol in the world. Now, were there images? Yes. Were there so-called gods? Yes. But Paul is saying, as people of faith, we know that those things are not even real. They're just things. There's nothing behind them. There's no power behind them. And that there is no God but one. It's part of our faith. It's who we are. We are people who have acknowledged that we serve one true God. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords. And what is he saying? He's saying, well, yeah, the Gentiles have created all of these different gods for all different aspects of life. And even though those gods may not truly exist, they have power over you. Have you ever had something control you that doesn't even exist? You ever been mad about something and it just wrecks your whole day and causes you to make all kinds of terrible decisions, and then you find out the thing you're mad about wasn't even true? And that's the basic idea. It is allowing something that doesn't really exist control you, manipulate you, and that's what these people were doing. The idol is nothing because the God in whom it represents is nothing. It doesn't actually exist. But we know that there is only one God. The term is monotheistic. And the idea of that being an issue was with the Romans, who believed that Christians were actually atheists. They say, well, those Christians are atheists because they don't believe in all of our gods. But in reality, they believed in the one true God. And Paul says that there are many gods, but these are so-called gods. Look at verse 6. He says, yet for us, there is but one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and we exist for Him, one Lord, Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we exist through Him. The truth is, and what Paul has stated, and the truth stands true forever and will ever stand true, and it is a part of the Christian faith, it is a part of the unity that draws us together, is that we collectively believe this to be true. That there is one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. Now the question is, how does that change your life? How does knowing that there is one who created all things and you, how does knowing that there is one who provides all things, how is knowing that there is one who will give you life eternal when this life is over? How does knowing that there is one who's given you all instruction on how to live your life in godliness, there's no other. how does that change how you live in the present? How does that change your future? How does that change your past? How does that change your present? How does that change you in knowing and believing this truth that there is one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all? This morning, if there's anybody who desires to follow the teachings of that one God, to become part of his family by being baptized by faith in his Son, to receive the forgiveness of sins that he has provided out of his compassion, his love, and his grace. If that is you this morning and you desire to make that step of faith, the opportunity is available for you. Maybe you've been on that walk for a while. Maybe you have allowed other things to get between you and your God. Maybe you have trusted in things that were of this world and not of heavenly realities. Whatever your need might be this morning, if you would come forward as we stand and as we sing.